Montana Territory, autumn 1888. Raymond Kellerman was a 41-year-old former Navy Construction Battalion's engineer who had spent 3 winters in the Aleutian Islands, building airstrips and Quonset hut barracks in wind that never stopped. He had returned to the Flathead Valley with his wife Catherine and 2 young daughters, and he could not stop thinking about one thing: the curved metal shells that deflected gales without a single timber cracking. That September, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cordwood for the long freeze, Raymond rode into Kalispell and bought a surplus Quonset hut shell for $40. When he hauled the curved corrugated panels back on a flatbed wagon, the trading post crowd gathered to watch. Jonas Millwright, the valley's master builder with 32 years of experience, shook his head. "You planning to live in a grain silo, Kellerman?" Raymond said nothing. He unloaded the metal and started assembling the arched frame over his existing log cabin, leaving an 18-inch air gap between the logs and the inner curve of the metal shell. The cabin sat inside like a smaller box within a larger one. Catherine Kellerman stood in the cabin doorway with her arms folded, watching her husband bolt metal panels to the arched ribs. "It looks like a locomotive shed," she said quietly. "It will work," Raymond said. "People are talking. Let them." The problem was not whether it looked strange. Everyone agreed it did. The problem was that Raymond Kellerman had spent 3 winters on Aleutian Island, where the wind came off the Bering Sea at 40 miles per hour for weeks without stopping. And he had learned one thing the valley had not: moving airstrips heat faster than still air ever could. Raymond and Catherine had been married 14 years. They had 2 daughters, Margaret, age 9, and Ruth, age 6. The family had arrived in the Flathead Valley in the spring of 1887, homesteading 80 acres near the South Fork of the river. Raymond had built the cabin that summer using local lodgepole pine, a simple 16 by 20-foot structure with a stone fireplace in the center and 2 small windows facing east. It was a solid cabin. The logs were tight. The chinking was good. But Raymond knew what everyone in the valley knew. Come January, you could stand 3 feet from the fireplace and still feel the cold creeping through the walls. The Holleran family, 2 miles west, had lost their youngest child the previous winter. Pneumonia, the doctor said. But Raymond had seen the cabin. Every gap around the door whistled. The walls sweated ice on the inside when the fire died overnight. The cold did not come from lack of heat. It came from wind forcing its way through every crack and seam, stealing warmth faster than any stove could replace it. Raymond had watched the Quonset huts on a dock deflect wind that would have torn a timber frame apart. The metal shell took the force and turned it aside. The air inside the hut stayed still, even when the gale screamed past the walls at 50 miles per hour. That stillness was the secret. When he explained this to Jonas Millwright at the sawmill in October, the master builder laughed. "You are going to cook your family alive in that sweatbox, Kellerman. Metal heats up. You will be sitting in an oven come July." "There is an air gap," Raymond said. "Air does not stop heat. Still air does." Jonas shook his head and walked away. By November, the mockery had spread through the valley. At the Sunday church gathering, women whispered that Catherine Kellerman must be terrified living under all that metal. At the trading post, men joked that Raymond had built a tomb for his family. The storekeeper, a man named Frank Osborne, told anyone who would listen that the Kellermans would either freeze or suffocate before spring. Raymond ignored it. He finished sealing the base of the metal shell with packed clay and stone to block drafts at ground level. He checked every seam where the metal panels overlapped, making sure no wind could force its way into the air gap. The chimney pipe ran up through a sealed opening in the metal roof, venting cleanly without leaks. Inside the cabin, life continued as it always had. Catherine cooked on the iron stove. The girls played near the fireplace. The logs smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. But outside, the curved metal shell stood between them and the wind. December brought the first real cold. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees above zero, and the valley began burning through cordwood at a steady pace. Raymond kept his fire modest, feeding the stove 3 times a day, instead of the constant tending his neighbors required. The cabin stayed warm. Catherine noticed it first. "The floor is not cold," she said one morning. Raymond nodded. "No drafts. The walls are dry. Still air holds warmth." Margaret, the older daughter, pressed her hand against the log wall near her bed. "It does not feel like ice," she said. In a normal cabin, the walls grew cold overnight as the fire died down. By morning, frost formed on the inside of the logs, and you could see your breath until the stove roared back to life. But inside the metal shell, the air stayed still. The 18-inch gap between the metal and the logs trapped a layer of unmoving air, and that stillness held the heat close to the cabin walls. Raymond had learned the principle on IDOC. Moving air is a thief. It touches a warm surface and steals heat through contact, then moves on and does it again, endlessly. But still air is a blanket. It takes heat slowly, holds it close, and refuses to move. The thicker the layer of still air, the better the insulation. The metal shell stopped the wind completely. No matter how hard the gale blew outside, the air in the 18-inch gap stayed perfectly still. That gap acted as a buffer, keeping the cold from ever touching the cabin walls directly. The logs stayed warm. The family stayed warm, and the firewood lasted twice as long as it should have. But the valley did not believe in things it could not see. On December 20th, Jonas Millwright stopped by to deliver a load of lumber Raymond had ordered for repairs. He climbed down from his wagon and walked around the metal structure, shaking his head. "You still have not frozen yet," he said. "We will not," Raymond said. "You are using too much wood. I can smell it. I am using half what you are." Jonas laughed. "Impossible." Raymond opened the cabin door. Warm air poured out into the frozen December afternoon, visible as a soft wave of distortion in the cold. Jonas stepped closer, frowning. "How much firewood do you burn per day?" Raymond asked. "2 full loads in the morning, 2 at night, and I keep it fed all day. I burn 1 load in the morning and 1 at night. The stove goes low during the day, and we stay warm." Jonas stared at him. "That does not make sense." "It does, if the wind cannot reach the walls." Jonas walked around the structure again, this time running his hand along the metal. "The shell is cold," he said. "Of course it is. The wind touches it. But the cabin inside is warm, because the wind does not touch the cabin." Jonas said nothing. He climbed back onto his wagon and left without another word. The ridicule continued, but it was quieter now. People still called it a sweatbox, but fewer of them laughed. The Kellermans were warm, and everyone knew it. Then January arrived. A cold snap began on January 7th, 1889. The temperature dropped to 0 overnight, then kept falling. By the 9th, it was -10. By the 12th, it was -15. And on the night of January 14th, the thermometer outside Raymond Kellerman's cabin read -21 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind came with it. Not a gale, but a steady, relentless pressure from the north, 15 miles per hour without stopping, driving the wind chill far below the actual temperature. In a normal cabin, that wind would find every crack, every gap, every poorly chinked seam, and it would force freezing air inside faster than any stove could compensate. The valley burned firewood day and night. Families woke every 2 hours to feed their stoves. Children slept in coats. Women boiled water on the stovetop just to add moisture and warmth to the air. The Holleran family, who had lost a child the previous winter, moved their beds within 5 feet of the fireplace and kept the fire roaring 24 hours a day. Inside the metal-shelled cabin, Raymond Kellerman fed the stove twice a day and let it burn low overnight. The temperature inside the cabin stayed at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Catherine woke on the morning of January 15th and walked to the window. Frost covered the glass on the outside, thick and white. She touched the log wall beside the window. It was warm. "The stove is barely going," she said. Raymond nodded. He was sitting at the table, writing in a small notebook. "I let it go low at midnight. It has been 6 hours. It is still warm in here. The shell is working." Margaret and Ruth were still asleep in their beds, blankets loose, not bundled tight against the cold. Catherine looked at them, then back at her husband. "People are suffering out there," she said quietly. "I know. Jonas is going to come back. I know." On the 3rd day of the deep freeze, Jonas Millwright arrived at the Kellerman cabin unannounced. He climbed down from his wagon slowly, moving like a man who had not slept well in days. His face was red from cold and wind. His coat was buttoned to the throat. Raymond opened the door. Warm air billowed out into the frozen afternoon, and Jonas stopped walking. He stared at the open doorway, at the vapor rising from the warmth inside, and he did not speak. "Come in," Raymond said. Jonas stepped inside. The door closed behind him, and he stood in the center of the cabin, blinking. The stove was burning low, just a bed of coals glowing faintly. The temperature inside the cabin was warm enough that Catherine and the girls wore simple dresses. No coats, no shawls. Jonas pulled off his gloves and held his hands toward the stove. "It is warm in here," he said. "Yes," Raymond said. "How much wood have you burned today?" "1 load this morning. I will add another tonight." Jonas looked at the stove, then at the walls, then at the ceiling. "That is impossible," he said quietly. Raymond said nothing. Jonas walked to the log wall and pressed his hand against it. The wood was warm to the touch. Not cold, not damp. He walked to the corner and checked the chinking. Dry. He bent down and felt the floor. Warm. "You are using some trick," Jonas said. "No trick. Just still air." Raymond walked Jonas outside and around the perimeter of the metal shell. The wind was blowing steady at 15 miles per hour, and the cold bit through their coats immediately. Raymond pointed to the gap between the metal and the logs. "The wind hits the metal and stops," Raymond said. "It cannot get to the cabin walls. The air in this gap does not move. That still air is the insulation." Jonas stared at the gap. "Air is not insulation. Still air is. Moving air steals heat. Still air holds it." "How thick is the gap?" 18 inches. Jonas did the math in his head. 18 inches of dead airspace. No wind penetration. No convection. Just a layer of trapped, unmoving air surrounding the entire cabin. "You learned this in the Navy," Jonas said. "I learned it in the Aleutians. The Quonset huts kept us alive when the wind never stopped." Jonas nodded slowly. He looked at the metal shell, then at the cabin inside it, then back at Raymond. "I was wrong," he said. Raymond said nothing. "I would like to examine the construction more closely," Jonas said. "With your permission." "Tomorrow," Raymond said. "Come back tomorrow." The cold snap lasted 9 days. By the time it broke on January 16th, the Kellermans had used 8 loads of firewood total. Their neighbors had used 40 or more. The difference was measurable, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Word spread fast. By the end of January, 3 families in the valley had approached Raymond about building similar structures. Jonas Millwright, who had mocked the design in October, spent 2 days at the Kellerman cabin, taking measurements and sketching the metal shell frame. He admitted publicly, at the trading post, that he had been wrong. "I have built cabins for 32 years, Jonas said, and I did not understand what Kellerman understood. Wind is the enemy, not cold. Wind." The storekeeper, Frank Osborne, visited the cabin in early February and stood inside for 10 minutes without speaking. When he finally left, he told Raymond, "I will help you source more metal if others want to build these." Raymond nodded. "They will want to." By summer 1889, 7 families in the Flathead Valley had constructed similar metal shell structures over their existing cabins. The designs varied slightly. Some used salvaged barn metal. Others bought surplus railroad panels. But the principle remained the same. Create a windproof outer shell and trap a layer of still air between it and the living space. Jonas Millwright became the valley's primary builder of these hybrid structures. He refined Raymond's design, adding ventilation ports to prevent moisture buildup in the air gap during summer heat. He experimented with different gap widths and found that 18 to 24 inches provided the best balance between insulation and structural simplicity. The costs were modest. A surplus metal shell cost $30 to $50, depending on size and condition. Installation took 2 men 3 to 4 days. The firewood savings paid for the materials within a single winter. The technique spread slowly beyond the Flathead Valley. A few families near Kalispell adopted it. A rancher in the Bitterroot Valley heard about it and built a version using doubled canvas and timber framing instead of metal. The principle worked regardless of materials. Stop the wind, trap still air, hold the heat. But the innovation never reached widespread adoption. By the early 1900s, improved insulation materials and modern heating systems made the metal shell approach seem primitive. Fiberglass batting, mineral wool, and eventually foam insulation provided better thermal performance with less bulk. Central heating systems and oil furnaces eliminated the need for wood-burning stoves. Raymond Kellerman continued to live in his metal-shelled cabin until his death in 1923. The structure stood for another 15 years before the metal rusted through and the frame collapsed. By then, the valley had moved on. Modern homes with proper insulation and central heat were the standard. The old hybrid cabins were dismantled, the metal sold for scrap. Jonas Millwright built his last metal shell cabin in 1907. After that, he switched entirely to modern construction methods. When asked in 1912 why he had stopped building the shells, he said simply, "Better materials came along." But the physics Raymond Kellerman understood in 1888 did not change. Wind is still the enemy. Still air is still insulation. Thermal mass still stores and radiates heat. The principles worked then, and they work now. The difference is that Raymond Kellerman proved them with scrap metal and 18 inches of dead air when everyone said it could not be done. He kept his family warm at 68 degrees inside, while the valley dropped to minus 21 degrees outside. He used half the firewood his neighbors burned, and he did it because he understood one thing they did not. Moving, air steals heat, and still air holds it. Catherine Kellerman kept a journal throughout the winter of 1889. In her entry for January 15th, she wrote, "The cold outside is 21 degrees below zero. The cabin is warm. The girls sleep without fear. I do not know if the valley will forgive Raymond for being right, but I know we will survive, because he was." The journal is held in the Flathead County Historical Society archives. The metal shell that saved the Kellerman family is gone, rusted and scrapped decades ago. But the numbers remain: 68 degrees inside, minus 21 outside, and a temperature gap of 89 degrees maintained with half the fuel the valley thought was necessary. The sweatbox worked. And that is the end of the story. The principle of using an outer shell to create a dead airspace is not unique to Raymond Kellerman. Similar techniques appeared in Scandinavian construction, Russian timber homes, and indigenous structures across cold climates. What made Kellerman's approach notable was its use of war-surplus industrial materials applied to frontier conditions, where conventional wisdom said it would not work. The thermal performance was measurable. 18 inches of still air provides an insulation value roughly equivalent to 6 inches of modern fiberglass batting. The metal shell, despite conducting heat readily, acted as a windbreak so effective that convective heat loss dropped to nearly zero. The combination allowed a modest wood stove to maintain comfort in conditions that would have required constant stoking and far more fuel in a conventional cabin. Modern building science confirms what Kellerman demonstrated empirically. Wind-driven infiltration accounts for 25 to 40% of heat loss in poorly sealed structures. Eliminating that infiltration with an airtight outer barrier reduces heating demands dramatically, even without adding traditional insulation materials. The metal shell cabins of the Flathead Valley were not engineering marvels. They were pragmatic solutions, built by people who understood one fundamental truth. The biggest enemy in a Montana winter is not the cold itself, but the wind that carries it through every crack and seam in your walls. Raymond Kellerman stopped the wind. That was enough. By the 1930s, most of the original metal-shelled cabins had been abandoned or demolished. A few remained as outbuildings or storage sheds. One structure near Kalispell survived into the 1940s, used as a workshop by a blacksmith who appreciated the temperature stability for his metalworking. The technique did not disappear entirely. Variations on the principle appeared in later construction methods: double wall framing, rain screen cladding, and ventilated facades all rely on the same core concept of creating an air gap to control moisture and improve thermal performance. Modern builders use better materials and more sophisticated engineering. But the physics Raymond Kellerman demonstrated with surplus metal and lodgepole pine logs remains unchanged. Catherine Kellerman outlived her husband by 19 years. She moved to Kalispell in 1924 and lived with her daughter Margaret until her death in 1942. In interviews late in her life, she spoke about the winter of 1889 with quiet pride. "People thought Raymond was crazy," she said in 1938. "They laughed at the metal shell. They said we would freeze, or cook, or suffocate. But we stayed warm. We stayed safe. And Raymond never said, 'I told you so.' He just kept the fire going and let the results speak." Margaret Kellerman married a rancher and raised 4 children in the Bitterroot Valley. Ruth Kellerman moved to Seattle and worked as a school teacher. Both women remembered the metal-shelled cabin with fondness, not as a hardship or an oddity, but as the place where they learned that unconventional solutions can work when the principles behind them are sound. Jonas Millwright died in 1931. His obituary in the Kalispell newspaper mentioned his decades of building experience and his willingness to adapt new techniques. It did not mention the metal shell cabins specifically, but several families who attended his funeral remembered them. "Jonas admitted when he was wrong," one neighbor said. "That is rarer than you would think." The trading post, where Raymond bought the original Quonset hut shell, closed in 1919. The building stood empty for years before being demolished in 1947. The site is now a parking lot. No marker indicates what happened there, or what Raymond Kellerman hauled away on a flatbed wagon in the autumn of 1888. The last known metal shell cabin in the Flathead Valley was dismantled in 1951. A farmer tore it down to salvage the metal for roofing on a new barn. The logs were burned. The stone foundation was buried. Within a year, grass covered the site, and no visible trace remained. The knowledge faded with the structures. By the 1960s, few people in the valley remembered the metal shell cabins at all. When insulation became standard in residential construction, the need for unconventional solutions disappeared. The techniques that had kept families warm in the 1880s became historical footnotes, remembered by a shrinking number of old-timers who had lived through the transition. In 2003, a historian researching frontier building techniques in Montana came across Catherine Kellerman's journal in the Flathead County Archives. The entry describing the winter of 1889 caught her attention. She tracked down descendants of the family and interviewed them, but none had direct knowledge of the metal shell cabin. The technique had been forgotten. The historian published a paper on unconventional insulation methods in frontier settlements. She included the Kellerman cabin as a case study, noting the measurable fuel savings and the temperature differential achieved with minimal materials. The paper circulated in academic journals, but gained little attention outside scholarly circles. Raymond Kellerman's innovation did not change the course of building science. It did not become a standard technique or inspire widespread adoption. But for 9 days in January 1889, it kept a family warm when others struggled. And it proved a principle that conventional wisdom said could not work. Before building any structure, especially one involving metal cladding, air gaps, or unconventional materials, consult with licensed structural engineers and building code officials. Modern construction standards exist for good reasons: fire safety, moisture control, structural integrity, and long-term durability. The techniques described in this story worked under specific historical conditions, but may not meet current codes or safety requirements. Professional guidance is essential. The principle Raymond Kellerman demonstrated remains valid. Controlling airflow and creating thermal buffers reduces heating demands. Modern applications of this principle include double stud walls, insulated sheathing, and rain screen systems. These methods achieve superior performance with materials engineered for durability and safety. The metal shell cabins of the Flathead Valley were products of their time, pragmatic, improvised, and effective within their limitations. They solved a specific problem with available materials and basic physics. They were not perfect, but they worked. Raymond Kellerman did not invent thermal mass or dead air insulation. He did not discover new physics or revolutionize building science. He simply understood what the wind does to heat, and he stopped the wind from doing it. That understanding, applied with $40 of surplus metal and 18 inches of empty space, kept his family warm at 68 degrees inside, while the valley froze at minus 21 degrees outside. It used half the firewood his neighbors B. The valley continued to change through the 1890s. The Northern Pacific Railway extended a branch line to Kalispell in 1892, bringing manufactured goods, coal stoves, and modern building materials that had been impossible to transport by wagon. The trading post expanded into a proper mercantile with plate glass windows and a printed catalog. Families who had homesteaded with nothing but axes and determination now had access to mail-order supplies and professional contractors. Jonas Millwright adapted with the times. He learned to work with milled lumber, factory-made windows, and cast iron hardware. He installed the valley's first coal furnace in 1894 in a banker's home near the center of Kalispell. The system worked beautifully, providing even heat to every room through a network of iron registers and ductwork. It was expensive, but it was modern. But Jonas never forgot the lesson Raymond Kellerman had taught him. When a young homesteader asked him in 1896 how to keep a small cabin warm through winter on a tight budget, Jonas did not recommend coal or a larger stove. He recommended an outer shell and an air gap. "Stop the wind first," Jonas said. "Everything else is secondary." The homesteader built a simplified version using vertical board siding over his log walls with a 4-inch air gap. It was not as effective as Raymond's metal shell, but it cut his firewood use by a third. The cost was $12 in materials and 2 days of labor. Jonas supervised the work and charged nothing for his time. "Kellerman showed me I was wrong about air," Jonas told the young man. "I spent 30 years thinking walls were what mattered. But it is the space between the walls that does the work." Raymond heard about it and smiled. He did not say anything, but Catherine saw the look on his face and knew what it meant. Vindication is sweeter when it comes quietly. By 1900, the valley had grown prosperous. Wheat farming replaced subsistence homesteading. Sawmills operated year-round. The town of Kalispell incorporated and elected a mayor. Electric lights appeared on Main Street in 1901, powered by a small hydroelectric plant on the river. The metal shell cabins began to seem old-fashioned. New homes were built with proper foundations, balloon framing, and lath and plaster walls. They had coal furnaces or large wood-burning boilers that heated water circulating through cast iron radiators. The technology was proven, the comfort level was higher, and the aesthetic was respectable. Raymond Kellerman's cabin, with its curved metal roof and frontier simplicity, looked increasingly out of place. Visitors from Kalispell sometimes asked if it was a storage building or a workshop. When Raymond explained it was his home, they nodded politely and changed the subject. But the cabin stayed warm. It always stayed warm. Margaret Kellerman married in 1903. Her husband, a rancher named Thomas Hendricks, built her a modern home in the Bitterroot Valley with a coal furnace and indoor plumbing. When Margaret visited her parents in the old cabin, she noticed how different it felt from her new house. "Your house is warmer," she told her mother. "We use less fuel," Catherine said. "But it feels warmer, not just the temperature, the air." Catherine nodded. "Your father says it is because the air does not move. Modern furnaces push heat through vents. The air moves all the time. Here, the warmth just sits still and holds." Margaret understood. In her new home, she could feel drafts near the windows even when the furnace roared. In her parents' cabin, the air was perfectly calm. The warmth did not blow past you. It surrounded you. Raymond spent his later years working as a surveyor for the county. He mapped roads, laid out property boundaries, and consulted on bridge construction. He was known as a careful, methodical man who checked his measurements twice and trusted mathematics over intuition. In 1912, a young engineer from the University of Montana visited the valley to study irrigation systems. He heard about Raymond Kellerman's cabin and asked to see it. Raymond walked him through the structure, explaining the air gap, the thermal barrier, and the wind-blocking principle. The engineer took notes. He measured the gap width, examined the metal panels, and asked detailed questions about fuel consumption and interior temperature stability. When he finished, he shook Raymond's hand. "You built an empirical demonstration of convective heat loss prevention," the engineer said. Raymond smiled. "I built a windbreak. It is more than that. You proved a principle. I kept my family warm. That is all I proved." The engineer published a brief mention of the cabin in a paper on frontier building techniques. He did not call Raymond an innovator or a pioneer. He simply noted that practical observations of thermal performance had led to effective solutions long before building science formalized the underlying principles. Raymond read the paper and set it aside. He had never needed academic validation. The warmth in his cabin had been validation enough. Ruth Kellerman, the younger daughter, left Montana in 1908 to attend normal school in Seattle. She became a teacher and rarely returned to the valley. When she did visit, she marveled at how little the cabin had changed while the world around it had transformed completely. "Everything else is different," she told her father in 1918. "Automobiles, telephones, electric lights. But this cabin is exactly the same. It still works," Raymond said. "It always worked." Yes. Jonas Millwright suffered a stroke in 1927 and could no longer work. He spent his final years in a small house in Kalispell, built by his son using modern methods. The house had central heating, insulated walls, and double-hung windows with weather stripping. It was comfortable and efficient. But Jonas told his son, more than once, that the warmest building he had ever been in was Raymond Kellerman's metal shell cabin in the winter of 1889. "It should not have worked as well as it did," Jonas said. But it did. His son, who had grown up with modern construction and never known the hardship of frontier winters, did not fully understand. "It was just a cabin, Father." "It was proof," Jonas said. "Proof that understanding beats tradition." Raymond Kellerman died in his sleep on March 3, 1923. He was 76 years old. He had lived in the metal shell cabin for 35 years, through every winter, never once struggling to stay warm. The obituary in the Kalispell newspaper mentioned his work as a surveyor and his service in the Navy. It did not mention the cabin. Catherine stayed in the cabin for another year, but it was too large for one person and too isolated. She moved to Kalispell in 1924 and lived with Margaret until her own death in 1942. The cabin stood empty after Catherine left. The metal rusted. The logs dried and cracked. By 1930, the structure was clearly abandoned, and neighbors began salvaging useful materials. The stove was removed. The windows were taken. The door was pulled off its hinges. In 1938, a windstorm tore part of the metal shell loose. The corrugated panels flapped and banged for weeks until someone climbed up and cut them free. The metal was sold for scrap. The exposed logs weathered rapidly without protection. By 1945, the cabin was a ruin. The roof had collapsed. The walls leaned inward. Vegetation grew through the floor. The stone fireplace still stood, solid and unmoved, but everything around it had surrendered to time. A rancher bought the property in 1948 and cleared the site. The remaining logs were burned. The metal was hauled away. The stone from the fireplace was reused in a new barn foundation. By 1950, grass covered the ground where Raymond Kellerman's cabin had stood, and only a slight depression in the earth hinted that anything had been there at all. The principle Raymond demonstrated did not die with the cabin. Modern building science rediscovered and refined the concept of using air gaps and outer barriers to control heat transfer. Rain screen siding systems, ventilated facades, and double wall construction all rely on the same physics Raymond understood in 1888. Stop the wind, trap still air, and control the movement of heat. The difference is that modern systems use engineered materials, precise calculations, and standardized installation methods. They perform better and last longer than Raymond's improvised metal shell. But they prove the same point. Air movement matters more than most people realize. In 2007, an energy efficiency consultant in Missoula designed a home using a ventilated rain screen system over insulated sheathing. The air gap was only 3/4 of an inch, far smaller than Raymond's 18 inches. But the principle was identical. The home used 40% less heating energy than comparable houses without the air gap. When asked about the inspiration for the design, the consultant mentioned Scandinavian building traditions and modern building science research. He had never heard of Raymond Kellerman or the metal shell cabins of the Flathead Valley. The knowledge had been forgotten and then rediscovered, as often happens. Catherine Kellerman's journal remains in the Flathead County Historical Society archives. Researchers occasionally request access to study frontier life, family structures, or women's experiences in Montana Territory. Few pay attention to the entry about the winter of 1889 and the temperature inside the cabin. The numbers are there: 68 degrees inside, minus 21 degrees outside, half the firewood burned. The proof is recorded, dated, and preserved. But proof without context is just data, and data without application is just history. Raymond Kellerman understood wind. He understood still air. He understood that the simplest barrier, placed in the right location, could solve a problem that brute force could not. He built a windbreak, called it a cabin, and lived in warmth, while others burned cord after cord of wood and still shivered. He did not write papers or teach classes or seek recognition. He simply stopped the wind and let the results speak. The valley laughed at his sweatbox until winter proved it was not a sweatbox at all. It was a shelter built on principle, and principle does not care what people call it. The story ends where it began, with cold outside, warmth inside, and a gap of still air holding the difference in place.